Lincoln, look out! Clyde shouted. Lincoln woke up from his daydream and looked to see his infected neighbor, Mr. Grouse, charging at him with a rake. They all screamed as their elderly neighbor reached Lincoln and swung his rake in blind rage. Lincoln then dove out of the way and landed on his right side again. He then looked back up to see Mr. Grouse coming at him and swinging at him again. Lincoln wasn't going to be able to get out and out of the way in time. All he could do was hold Lala tighter to him and brace himself. The infected adult rose and the rake prepared to swing downward. "No!" Clyde shouted. He lashed onto the end of the rake and held onto it with all of his might. Then all of Lincoln's sisters did the same. "No, don't!" Lincoln shouted. He didn't want Clyde or his sisters to put themselves in harm's way for his sake. Lincoln quickly got to his feet and gingerly pulled Lola away from his body. He told her to run to the front doors as he tried to get her down, but she was reluctant. Lincoln pleaded with Lola to hurry as he tried his best to get her to let go of him. Mr. Grouse began to shake the rake as Clyde and Lincoln's sisters held onto it, with all the strength they could muster. Eventually they couldn't hold on any longer, and the force of the rake shaking sent them flying a few yards away. Lincoln shouted again, and the old man looked back at him with same filled rage that every grown-up had. Lincoln was terrified, but he had to stand between his neighbor and Lola, who, thanks to her stubborn fear, was in harm's way. Lincoln then wished Lola had run when he told her to, but he understood why she was scared. They all were. Lincoln then grabbed Lola by the hand. "Get ready to run," he told her, "and no matter what, don't stop until you reach the door." She just responded with a gargled sob and nod. Lincoln knew that she wouldn't be able to run very well since she was wearing a dress and she was no longer wearing any shoes. Her heels that usually wore must have fallen off some time ago. The neighbor charged at Lincoln again. He ran and tugged Lola along, putting himself between her and Mr. Grouse, ducking as he swung his rake at him again. Lincoln then let go of Lola's hand and watched as she continued to run towards their house. She then noticed that Lincoln was no longer beside her. She then looked back and cried his name. "Keep going," he told her. He then looked at Clyde and all of his other sisters. He told them to run too. Clyde then stretched his arms out and began hurrying them towards the door. Lincoln then looked back at his neighbor, who was also rushing at him again. He couldn't believe how fast Mr. Grouse was moving at his old age. He quickly jumped out of his way and the adult swung like a rake again. Only this time, Lincoln slipped on dog poop and he skidded to a halt on the ground. Mr. Grouse came at Lincoln again as he lied on the ground. Lincoln desperately tried to get up, but he was exhausted. He then had more physical in the last hour than he had all week, and he was busy. He did have 10 sisters after all. As Lincoln struggled to find the emergency act fast, he wished that he had more than anything that none of this was happening. He thought today was going to be like any other day. He just wanted to be in his room reading comics in his underwear and planned to do activities he would do tomorrow. And the next day, like video games, was going to be going to the arcade, going to the park, watching his favorite shows, playing with his friends, spending time with his sisters. He would have never thought that he'd meet his demise by his neighbor, Mr. Grouse. The grown-up raised his rake again and shrieked as he prepared to deliver the lethal blow. Then over the top roar of Mr. Grouse, Lincoln heard one of his sisters cry out and Clyde shout something. Lana suddenly appeared, grunted as she struck Mr. Grouse in the ankle as hard as she could with her wrench, causing a snapping sound. Her neighbor dropped to the knee, planted the handle to the rake against the ground to support his weight. He then swung at Lana and struck her in the face with his hand. "Lana, no!" Lincoln shouted. His other sisters quickly rushed to Lincoln and Lana's aid. Clyde desperately tried to grab whoever he could to stop them, but they were too quick. They all leapt and piled on Mr. Grouse's back as he dropped to the ground under their weight. Lucy then took out her screwdriver, plunged it right in the back of Mr. Grouse's head, ending the old man's strain of rage. Lincoln just lay there stunned at what he just witnessed. His sister stared at Lucy as well, who seemed to be taken aback of what she had just done as they were. She then turned to them and noticed the discernment on their faces. "What else was I supposed to do?" she asked. It was a few seconds before anyone said anything, and then the only sounds that were sounds of screaming kids, wailing adults coming from the distance. Finally, Lana spoke up. "She's right. We have no other choice. She then looked at a wrench she had used earlier. Still had bloodstains on it. We have to protect each other. Lincoln then began to get up as Clyde reached for them after in silence. I'm sorry, man, Clyde said. They were so fast It's okay, Lincoln told him, before looking back at his sisters. Thanks for the help, he began, as he stood up and walked towards his sisters. But I don't want any of you to do something as reckless as that to me ever again. His voice was stern by the end of his sentence. His sisters all stared at him with worried and slightly puzzled expressions. We're just trying to protect you, said Lana. That's my job, Lincoln responded, stretched his arms out, and hugged all of his sisters in a comforting embrace. They all held each other for a few seconds, ignoring the world that was going to continue to plunge deeper and deeper into chaos. Come on, Lincoln finally said, his voice bringing them back to cold reality. It's not safe out here. He motioned towards the door, waited for them to all get in front of him. And Clyde. They all looked and more at their dead neighbors. Lucy debated whether or not to remove the screwdriver from his head and then take it with her. But before deciding against it, she had plenty of screwdrivers and tools in her room. Lincoln spoke once they were landing on the front porch. I'll go in first. They all nodded. Lincoln looked at Clyde, who nodded as well. I'm right behind you, buddy. And with that, Lincoln slowly turned the doorknob. Lincoln opened the door very slowly, to which it was very rare if any ever did. This was like a normal day. He would swing the door open, kicking off his shoes and throw his backpack off in the random direction. But this was not a normal day. Probably wouldn't be a normal day for the rest of his life or sisters' lives. In the house was dark and quiet. Sunlight streaming through the broken windows, most likely from the blast, was the only thing providing illumination. Once outside, they could still hear the scenes of chaos and death. The only thing scarier of these sounds were the sounds of silence coming from every room of this house. There was a loud house. It was never that quiet. Lincoln then walked softly across the living room, wondering where his mom could be, hoping that she'd be waiting for him right by the front door. Maybe she left to go find them? No, that would mean she would have to take Lily with her, and there was no way she was going to risk putting her in any danger in the outside world, and she couldn't leave her out there either. That meant that her mom had to be there. But where? Lincoln looked back at Clyde and his sisters, who already knew entered the house. Then they all looked at the staircase and then at the door to the parents' room. Either she's upstairs in Lily's room or in her room, Lincoln thought to himself. He decided to go check his mom's room first, since it was the closest. He tiptoed over to the door and slowly turned the doorknob. The door creaked open as he steadily peeked inside. He scanned the room from left to right until his parents' bed came into view. There was a lump under the covers the size of his mom. Was she asleep? Lincoln wondered. How could she have slept through the blast and the ensuing phenomenon, like the sounds of kids screaming and the roar of the plane crash? Maybe she's just tired, Lincoln thought to himself. She's had a busy day, always working, cleaning, raising her kids. She deserves some rest. Plus, living in a house with 11 kids, you aren't asleep through anything. Lincoln continued to open the door. His siblings crept up behind him and peered into the room until all they saw was a lump on the bed as well. Mommy! Lola screamed. Lincoln turned to hush her, and when he looked back at the bed, the shape was risen to an upright position, blankets still covering its body. The siblings rushed past him, leaving Lincoln and Clyde alone in the doorway. They surrounded the form on the bed, all speaking at once. Finally, Lola hopped on the bed and removed the covers to over their mom's head. She screamed. Everyone else screamed as well. Tears began to fill their eyes. Their mom was one of them. She was infected. Mommy! Lola screamed again. The infected adult used their mom hissed and raised their arm towards Lola. The younger girl was scared to move. She sat on the bed and continued to cry, as all of their sisters did as well. No! Lincoln screamed. His worst fear had finally been realized. He then rushed towards his mom. No, no, no! He continued. He jumped onto the bed and dove right to his mom. Yet he forced the mattress. Surprisingly, he was able to hold her down. You can't be gone. You can't leave us. We need you. Lincoln's face swelled in tears and sweat. He looked into his mother's eyes and saw no sense of recognition, No sense of emotion, only the need to cause harm. His mom suddenly found the strength to shove him off. She continued to look at him for a moment, then turned back to Lola, apparently deciding which she would be an easier target. The tears continued streaming down her face as her mom grabbed her, but instead ended up knocking her off the bed. Her siblings tried to get the best to break the fall as their mom shuffled to move the covers out of her way just so she can get up off the bed. Lincoln got back up and slammed into his mom again, holding her against the bed's headboard. He then looked back at his terrified siblings and told them to run, but just as they had before, they refused. Lincoln couldn't hold his back mom any longer as she shoved him again, harder than last time, which caused him to fall out of the bed as well. Their mom finally removed the covers off from the rest of her body and stood up. She towered all over them. Lincoln's sisters continued to wail as their infected mom reached for them. Lincoln stood up again. This time he was angry. He glared at what used to be his mom, so nice and caring, now taken over by a disease. He couldn't believe this was how it ended for her. She worked so hard in her life caring for 11 kids, always trying her best to suit their needs, always trying her best to love them all, and now she was gone, consumed by the same fate, like any other adult in Royal Woods. Why now? He thought to himself. Why didn't it have to be today? A day where everyone else still had whole lives ahead of them. So much potential wasted. It couldn't have been several million years in the future, when humans probably have been long gone. Instead, the human race was probably going to end today. This thought made Lincoln even more angrier. He laid the blame on the whole thing that stood in front of him. The thing that represented everything that had gone wrong today. The thing that was the huge sinister plague that was responsible for so many deaths. He harnessed that rage, projected the fact, and thing used to be his mom outside of his head. He charged right straight for it and slammed onto it with such force that the monster's whiplash before it started falling. Lincoln continued to push it until they were both falling. He suddenly felt his body jerk, and then felt something hitting the opposite of the nightstand next to his mom's bed. Lincoln's sisters all cried out as the sound filled the room. Lincoln soon used to be his mom lay on the floor. Lincoln continued to wrap his arms around her until she realized she was no longer moving. "Lincoln!" He heard Clyde call out to him. Lincoln lifted his head up to look at Clyde, and then to his sisters who just stood and frozen with their mouths hung open, tears still crawling and down their faces. Lincoln's rage suddenly left his body and looked around the creature, suddenly remembering even though he was a crazed adult, it was still his mom. She was lying still frozen on the floor. Lincoln then noticed a red spot at the corner of the nightstand. "No," Lincoln said, quietly this time. He quickly got up and moved his mom so that she was lying on her back. That's when he finally saw that he was afraid he'd see, a huge gash on the right side of her head. Lincoln threw himself away from his mom's body, landed on his butt as he just sat there in stunned silence. What have I done? He turned towards his siblings, who looked as if though they were trying to grasp what just happened. You killed her, Lucy finally said. No, Lincoln fought, searching for the deepest reaches of his brain, but no response. He couldn't come up with anything. Mommy! Lolis cried again, and all of Lincoln's sisters ran up to their mom's body and began to cry. Lincoln finally got up and walked over to his sisters. His eyes began filling with tears as well. He held his arms out, and his sisters welcomed him to the huddle with open arms. They knew that he didn't mean to kill their mom, and that she was only trying to protect them. And all they held each other as they continued to cry over their losses. Clyde then stood awkwardly a few feet from them. Tears began to stream down his face too. He'd never seen his friend Clyde like that before, and it broke his heart. As soon as Lincoln began to settle down, he looked at his mom again. He wiped his tear-stained face, and that's when he noticed the baby monitor on the nightstand. Lily! He shouted out loud, as somehow his sisters all heard him from over her sobs. Worry quickly spread over their faces as it hit the same. Their youngest sister was probably the baby of the family, most vulnerable to all the Louds. Lincoln told his sisters to wait in the living room for Clyde to watch them as he raced out of his parents' bedroom and upstairs. Lincoln's sisters followed suit, completely ignoring their brother's orders, and Clyde calling out for them to wait. Lincoln was upstairs in the record of time. He burst down the door in the hall into Lily's room. A single breath, he peered over Lily's crib where she lay, sleeping peacefully, clutching her purple blanket and sucking her thumb. Lincoln then reached out to touch her as she slowly opened her eyes. "Inkin," she said cheerfully. Lincoln smiled in relief. Relief washed and spread over into his entire body. He turned behind him and saw his younger sisters and Clyde all standing in the doorway. They all had worried expressions on their faces. "She's okay," Lincoln told them. The war very slowly disappeared from their faces, but they still had a look of dread in their eyes. "She's okay," Lincoln repeated. "It's okay. It's okay. Everything's gonna be okay." "Lincoln," Clyde said. Lincoln suddenly had the urge of nausea as his body and the room began to sway back and forth. He looked around the room and saw a small plastic trash bin. He hurried over to it, let everything loose that he had eaten that day, and that the stress having to protect his sisters and fend off the feral adults, and kill his mom had clearly taken a toll on Lincoln. He'd thrown up before, sure, but sometimes when he was sick. Sometimes he had eaten too much junk food, but he never thrown up out of fear, and he dropped to his knees and spit out the last bit of foul fluids that remained. He breathed heavily and wiped his nose. As soon as he was done, he looked over his sisters, Clyde, and who just stood there with a stare of concern. "Lincoln," Clyde repeated. "I'm okay," Lincoln told him as he got up. "It's just stress." They all got up, but they were all flustered. Lincoln got up and walked over to Lily's crib. Lily looked worried too. Lincoln smiled at her, to which it made the smile reappear on her face. Lincoln then looked over at his sisters again, studied their appearances. Lisa had dirt stains on her clothes and blood stains on her shoes, probably from the walking in the puddles of their classroom. Lucy had blood stains on her clothes from when she stabbed Mr. Grouse in the back of the head. Lana had blood stains all over her clothes from being her teacher and Scoots with her wrench, as well as a red bruise on her cheek from when Mr. Grouse struck her. And all of Lola's face was stained with makeup, had ruined everything from her crying, and a wet stain near the bottom of the front of her dress. No doubt Lola was probably more terrified than all of them. Lincoln then studied his own appearance. He had dirt, blood stains all over him, and a brown spot from his shoe from when he slipped on Charles's poop. He then looked back up and smiled. "Let's get you all cleaned up," he said. Lincoln and his sister sat quietly on the living room floor. They all cleaned up now. Electricity may have not worked, but luckily the water still ran, and Lincoln had helped wash his sisters, and now they were all nice and clean, and comfy and different clothes. Lola had to wear a different outfit and shoes, since they were a better suit to run in, just in case. After Lincoln was done helping clean up his sisters and himself, he went down to his mom's room and wrapped her in bed covers and closed the door. He never wanted to go in there again. Clyde then told Lincoln that they had to go to his parents' house to see if they were all right. Lincoln tried to convince him not to go, but he wouldn't let up. That's when Lisa spoke and told him that she's noticed that everyone seemed to be affected with the disease that are adults. Clyde broke down, realizing that his dads were most likely dead. It was quite of a task for Clyde to calm down, since his inhaler was almost empty. Luckily, Lisa was able to come up with something to substitute it. Lincoln held Clyde as he sobbed over his parents and Lincoln's sisters, who tried their best to comfort him. Then Lincoln and his siblings had the fact that their dad was probably as dead as well, which got a coat of fresh tears upon for them faces. After that, they boarded up the windows since there was no glass to keep out the outside world. Not the glass that would help anyway. Luckily, Lincoln still had plenty of wood lying around, since he used that to barricade himself whenever April Fool's Day came around. He missed it when it was the first thing that frightened him the most, his older sister Luann's pranks. He hoped and prayed that his older sisters were okay, and they decided not to board up the door in case if his older sister showed up. Instead, they moved the couch in front of the door and in the dining room table against the kitchen. When they moved to the couch, they found their pet dog Charles cowering underneath, as he was just happy for them to see that they were seeing him. There were also their pet hamster, Geo, who resided safely in his cage along with their pet bird, Walt, who rested comfortably in his cage as well. Lana had her miscellaneous pets that were also importantly, she had her pet frog Hobbs, her pet lizard Izzy, and as for their pet cat Cliff, they had no idea where he was, but they all hoped he was alive, safe somewhere. The house was the only protection they had against the outside world. Sure, there was Lisa's bomb shelter, but unfortunately a car had crashed and flipped right on top of it, so there was no way they would be able to get in there. Instead, all they could do was sit silently on the floor and wait for the older sisters to show up, hopefully all in one piece, and none of them were dead. Chris had hid in the dressing room of the department store that he managed. A few moments ago, he was helping a lady find some shoes for her 1-year-old son, and the next, a loud bang filled the air, and the glass of the doors of the windows of the store all shattered, sending them all falling to the ground. When Chris got up, he noticed that every light of the store was off and that the mother was on, screaming her son, biting into his face. Chris stood and frozen, wondering what the hell she was doing and what he could do. He was about to turn and cry out for help, when suddenly a few adults had been standing around them earlier, shoved Chris out of the way and began to devour the kid as well. "Don't! Someone help!" he screamed, and looked around the store. He was frightened to see all the other adults were busy in the store, fighting with parents of other kids over children's flesh. "What the hell is even going on?" Chris screamed inside his head, before turning to hide in the men's dressing room. "We're eating," he thought, he heard someone said, but he was too busy to run inside and hide, to wonder who answered them. He slammed the door behind them and locked it, and then he cowered into the small dark room, waiting for the screams of help to stop. Chris would swore he could hear voices. "Give me that! He's my son! I'm going to eat him! Sharing is caring! Go find your own, you little bastard!" Chris then reached into his pocket, pulled out his smartphone to call for help, but it won't turn on. "Fuck!" he said to himself. He threw the phone down, covered his ears, and continued to cower in the room. What felt like hours, but it only had to be a few minutes. Once the sounds and voices finally ceased, he then unlocked the door and peeked out from his hiding spot. There was no one in the store. There were little scenes of chaos throughout the store. Puddles of blood and corpses, dead kids polluted the ground. Chris figured that it was a chance to run out of the store. Outside was just as bad. Everywhere he looked, there were adults running from random directions. Some of them were chasing kids and teenagers who were either out of school for the day or just trunked. He then ran to the back of the parking lot where his car had parked, bobbing and weaving through the network of parked cars. The scared teenage girl ran by him, begging for help. When Chris saw the huge crazed man behind her, he pushed her out of the way and continued out of his car, ignoring her pleas for mercy and then her cries of pain. Chris was almost near to his car when the fellow adult who was crouching behind the car jumped out at him, causing him to fall to his back. But, "Please don't hurt me!" he cried, looking out of his arm's way of his reach. He waited for an adult to attack, but it never did. He could hear the adult's raspy breathing. It was standing right in front of him, but it wasn't attacking him. "Don't be a chicken," Chris said, heard the voice from the inside of his head say. He looked up to see the adult turn around and totter away from him. Chris didn't know why it didn't attack him, but he wasn't going to wait around to find out. He quickly got up and reached to his car in a few steps. All the windows were blown out, but the door was still locked. He fumbled with his keys and finally unlocking the driver's side of his door to the early 80s Ford Bronco. Once inside, he shoved the keys into the ignition and then turned them. It took a few tries, but the car eventually rumbled to life. Chris backed out and drove away as fast as the car left a clean trail of skid marks. As he drove, he ran past several scenes of mayhem. He couldn't drive without a few seconds, without seeing an adult tearing into a kid, or without any kids running up to this car for help. Chris wasn't about to stop for any of them. The only thing he cared about was getting himself to safety. Chris slowed down to a stop when he came to a stoplight. He noticed that all the lights were off, and he looked around to see several buildings were completely dark. Inside, all the electric signs out of the buildings were off as well. A realization quickly entered Chris's mind. That blast, it could have been that electronic pulse blast. He then continued to look around the world and how devoid of electricity and started to chuckle. With it became bit of frantic laughter. Looks like all those years of prepping such an event are about to pay off. He slammed down the gas and drove off into the distance. Chris thankfully got his lucky stars on his trusty Ford Bronco that had drove him to safety. It wasn't anything fancy, which is why it was so important. Nothing bad an EMP blast could damage. He continued to drive like a maniac through the direct streets of Michigan, passing by many scenes of destruction, cars and other vehicles that crashed into homes and buildings. Adults were continuing to devour helpless kids. At one point, he saw a few kids fighting back. They were able to take down a few adults at first, with random weapons such as blunt objects and knives, only to be swamped by their sudden surge in numbers. It was like a real-life zombie movie, where characters would get overwhelmed and devoured in grisly fashion. Chris loved horror movies, if it had gore. He was a fan of it. He never imagined to be part of one day. The scenes that played out in front of him distracted him from the road. A kid ran out in front of his vehicle, all bloodied and bruised. Chris ended up driving right over him. "Oh shit!" Chris said out loud, and then he drove faster, and when several adults began to run up to the kid's body. Chris didn't fret over what just happened. That kid was just as good as dead anyways, and besides, was one more kid to ruin my resume? He chuckled to himself. Chris was driving as fast as he could. He just wanted to get home so he could plan on his next course of action would be, maybe have a bite to eat. As Chris drove to the elementary school came into view, as he drew nearer he thought to himself, all those kids must be scared shitless, if any of them are still alive. He then began to wonder how messy it would be in there, when he noticed a brown-haired girl with a ponytail staring at the school with the backing to the street. "Watch out, Ponytail," Chris muttered to himself, not letting up at the gas at all. The girl noticed and quickly drove out of the way. "Dumb bitch," Chris spat. He then watched as the girl shrunk faster and further away from the rearview mirror. It was about 20 minutes and several dozen gruesome scenes later, Chris finally reached to his house. It was a small 3-bedroom residence with a basement. It wasn't anything too impressive to Chris, but it was enough. He quickly leapt out of his car and rushed to his front door, unlocking it and lay in the dark in the lonely house. Like any other part of the townhouses, electricity didn't work, but seeing as if though Chris was prepared for a major EMP that he had, electronics had stored into an electromagnetic pulse-proof container in his basement, and one of those electronics had a small portable freezer that was packed with meat. Chris's stomach rumbled as it was almost lunchtime, and he went down to the basement to grab some meat and threw it on it with some wood-burning stove. Once the meal was cooked, Chris dug into it like a feral beast and had one of those stains out there, so different, although throughout the adult life around the area he lived in had been gone missing. The field of activity slowly spreading towards Royal Woods. He knew who was responsible. It was him. Chris then thought back to his time in the army, remembering how it all ended up like this. Although he wasn't sure why those stains were suddenly like that, one thing he did know is that they both enjoyed the taste of human children.